Welcome back. This is part 2 of the final lecture in English 193, Communication in the Sciences. Today we're talking about how to make an infographic as best as you can. And the second part is a shorter part where we're going to discuss some examples that both really exceed in some capacities and also have some faults as well. So we're going to look at this example from Lemonly Studio first that looks at different statistics in the cultural sector for people working in the cultural sector. And this infographic is especially engaging because it has a lot of those different elements and principles all going on to stimulate our eye. There are differences in scale, in shape, in color, in value, in texture, and all of the information is organized into these these either circular or smaller rectangular arrangements that direct our eye to kind of columns or different groupings of information at a time. So even though there's a lot going on in the composition, because there's a careful kind of approach to the way that the information is either colored, shaped, or scaled, we feel as if there are these sort of little pockets, sub-compositions within it that we can safely navigate from one section to another, store the information in our brain, and keep going through the composition. And this kind of effect is because the designer has created a system, meaning that there are some things that stay the same no matter what. The color palette stays the same, the typeface stays the same, the decisions about the sizes of different elements do vary, but if you look especially at even like the 80% versus 84%, you'll notice that the font size of the actual numbers is kept the same, so that there is the establishment of a pattern between these elements, and that gives the user a sense of regularity enough so that all of the elements hold together. So I really like this example in terms of thinking about simple decisions that have to do with the appearance of the information from the start that are built to hold it all together. And it still has a fantastic sense of hierarchy in some ways, because the title is obviously the largest thing in the space and very demanding. The use of black type to be the most, in terms of value, to be the most demanding to our attention, and the repetition of culture creators, culture changers, cultural currency, etc., to move us around in that kind of circular rhythm. So there are a lot of good things going on. However, some strikes against this. The type size, for the most part, for the copy, the paragraphs that we want to read to glean the most, detailed information is so small. And especially for somebody who's just passing by and possibly walking by in a poster design, this would not be accessible or legible. The other thing about this poster is that there's just a lot of information on the page. Either there needs to be an even more sophisticated way to handle and display all of this information, or there needs to be better editing. There are so many different topics handled within this one poster, it could probably be easily divided into a poster for each of the kind of subheadings that it has. So be careful not to overload your composition. Just because you can fit it within the bounds of the canvas doesn't mean that it's going to be the best experience for your reader/user. Okay, the next example is a quasi-famous one by an illustrator and designer named Nicholas Bleckman. He made this amazing book for kids that's equally intriguing for adults, I think. It's called Infographics Animal Kingdom. And here I'm making the case that you can use illustration and representational imagery if it's actually also serving a sort of visual purpose, a data visualization purpose. So what I mean by that is if we look at this example, there's a bar graph, but instead of the bar graph just being represented by long skinny rectangles and a kind of, a fill color and an empty color, we also have graphic representations of the animals that the data is about for each line. And this adds to our understanding by, just simple silhouettes. You can see that they're very cartoony, they're abstracted, but they give us that reminder of, first of all, the shape, but also the actual approximate scale of each of those animals to one another. So there are different layers of information that are being communicated, even though on the surface it's just kind of fun and also gives us a nice transition from one side of the spread, the left page to the right page, through this sort of, the diagonal decrescendo in the different animals. So as we move from seal to dolphin to walrus, we can feel that rhythm, but it's also almost on a subliminal level, communicating the scale and the shape of each animal to one another. And then, of course, we see ourselves in there as the human, although the pasty pinkness isn't really racially representational. So please forgive that in this example. However, one last thing that I want to talk about is also to be playful, if you can, if it's called for it in the topic of your infographic, because just because we're talking about science doesn't mean that we can't also have a sense of whimsy. And sometimes this is an even more effective rhetoric, because scientific information can be kind of scary or intimidating to people. And if we find a way, like Nicholas Bleckman did, to make it more approachable through a playful visual style, that can actually be one of the most effective ways rhetorically to communicate scientific information. Okay, next we have space and shape. Very, again, returning to some of our most basic design elements, but I think that they're done really well in this example. In this infographic, which is a little old, it's from 2009 by Tomi Ahonen, we see this very dramatic difference in scale and also shape between different types of information. So at the top, we have different circles representing different sort of shares of the mobile market by different technologies and also different companies. And these are all graphed as pie charts so that we can see easily, how much is occupied by a particular institution or technology. Whereas below, we see just general uptake in terms of mobile technologies per country, and we can see this kind of global scale that we're only looking at one type of information, a single number that's represented a quantitative value, but it's represented visually. And then we see them stacked up from, in one sequencing reasoning. So from either from here, from high to low, but it could also be reversed. Whereas in the pie charts, we're looking at least two different levels of information. So I like this because there's a clear separation there in terms of the way that the information is being communicated, but also the pie charts are more dynamic because they vary in scale, they vary in color, and they create this lovely organic, very energetic kind of overall silhouette on the top that's very visually pleasing to look at. So that, by scaling it up, becomes the point of emphasis, and it also fills up the most, fills up the majority of the composition and becomes the real focal point of the poster. The things that I don't agree with in this design is that there's a kind of arbitrariness to the color. If we look up top, I don't know why the same red color scheme is repeated up top as well as for the three joined pie charts below, because those actually are dealing with two different qualifiers in the data. So they're types of information that don't have anything to do with one another, but they seem to just be made red on top and on bottom as a kind of bookending and sandwiching of the other elements in between. That's fine from a compositional standpoint, but in terms of information and communication design, it's misleading. The same goes with the larger blue pie chart on the left and the smaller one on the right. Again, very different types of information, but they're given the same color schemes. That's problematic. The other thing about this poster that it's not that I don't necessarily like it, but I wish that it were different, is that everything is very centered and very kind of stable. And I think that if you're going to create something organic as the kind of main event visually within your design, you can take more chances with it. An interesting possibility with this one is to see what would happen if you made it into a horizontal, like a landscape-oriented composition, where the circular elements, the pie charts, could flow across it and really take up more space, and you would still have enough space on the bottom to represent the bar graph. So even in those very beginning decisions, whether you make a vertical or or horizontally oriented design, can really impact the outcomes and the effectiveness of the final presentation. Okay, the last example that I want to talk about has again to do with this idea of layering information. But I think what's really successful in this last example is how many layers of information are represented in a single gesture. So this is an infographic that tracks all of the different space missions to Mars over the past several decades, and also categorizes them by country and through distance, or the length of the lines, also shows how close they got to the planet, whether outside the orbit, in the orbit, or actually onto the planet itself. And what I love about this is because it's creating a kind of flattening effect between two-dimensional and three-dimensional representation. And by doing that, you can actually make the same graphic element, so the curvy line extending from each entry in the timeline, map that onto the circular nature of the orbit, voila, you've got two different systems of representation happening at the same time. So this is quite clever. Again, other things that I think are less successful, I don't understand the color scheme exactly. I think that if you're choosing to represent the flags and also the colors, that there should be more harmony between those. And the other thing is that I feel like the text on the bottom is kind of squat and kind of squished into place. And those are important facts, and I feel everything could just be moved up a little bit farther in the composition to give that more breathing room. But otherwise, this is a lovely example of bringing together different ways of thinking and approaching your topic, but then visually combining them in a way that feels very fluid and natural. Okay, that concludes the second part of this lecture and the final lecture in this course, so you can give yourself an extra hurrah for that. So congratulations, and I hope that this gives you a sense of confidence in putting together your poster design and any other format of graphic visual communication you have in the future.